The letter arrived as the spring sun cast its golden light across the plains of Kansas, bringing with it a promise that would change Matthew Quinn's life forever. With calloused hands that betrayed years of hard labor, he carefully unfolded the delicate paper, his blue eyes scanning the graceful handwriting of a woman he had never met but would soon call his wife. Grace Porter had accepted his advertisement for a mail-order bride, but her words carried an unexpected complication: she would not come alone. Her younger sister, terribly ill with consumption, had no one else in the world. They would arrive together, or not at all. It was 1879 in Wichita, Kansas, a town that had transformed from a wild cattle outpost to a growing settlement with aspirations of respectability. Matthew stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, 5 miles outside of town, contemplating how his carefully ordered life was about to change. At 32, he had established himself as a successful cattle rancher, but the emptiness of his home echoed with each passing season. His decision to send for a bride had not been made lightly, but after burying his parents 3 years prior, the solitude had become unbearable. The whistle of the approaching train pierced the air as Matthew shifted nervously on the wooden platform of Wichita's bustling station. His hat was clutched tightly in his hands, revealing sandy brown hair that had been carefully combed for the occasion. Around him, the station teemed with life cowboys heading west, businessmen in tailored suits, families reuniting amid tears and laughter. But Matthew saw none of it, his eyes fixed on the black iron locomotive pulling into the station, belching clouds of steam that momentarily obscured the passengers disembarking. Eastern train arriving from St. Louis. The station master called out, his voice nearly drowned by the screech of brakes and the hissing of steam. Matthew swallowed hard, scanning the faces of women stepping onto the platform. He knew little of Grace Porter beyond what she had shared in her letters: that she was 26, had worked as a schoolteacher in Boston, and had lost her parents to influenza the previous winter. The few lines she'd written about her sister mentioned only that Lily was 19 and had once shown promise as a pianist before illness had weakened her. And he saw them 2 women standing somewhat apart from the crowd, the taller one supporting the smaller. The resemblance between them was unmistakable, though one burned with life while the other seemed to flicker like a candle in the wind. Grace Porter was not what he had expected. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a practical bonnet, and her traveling dress, though clearly worn, was impeccably clean. But it was her eyes that caught him: intelligent, direct, with a determination that spoke volumes. She spotted him almost immediately, recognition flickering across her features as she gently guided her sister forward. "Mr. Quinn." Her voice carried clearly despite the din of the station. Matthew stepped forward, suddenly aware of his rough appearance compared to the refined bearing of the woman before him. "Miss Porter, I'm pleased to finally meet you." Grace's smile was restrained, polite. "This is my sister, Lily." The younger Porter sister raised her face, and Matthew felt his heart constrict. Despite the sickness evident in her thin frame and the shadows beneath her eyes, she possessed an ethereal beauty. Her attempt at a smile was interrupted by a coughing fit that shook her entire body. Grace's arm instantly tightened around her waist, supporting her until the spasm passed. "Forgive me," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "The journey has been taxing." Matthew immediately moved to help. "My wagon is just outside. Let me take your trunks." As he reached for their luggage, he noticed how little they had brought: just 2 worn trunks, and a case that he suspected might contain a musical instrument. The life they had left behind in Boston seemed reduced to these few possessions. The ride to the ranch was largely silent, broken only by Grace's occasional questions about Wichita and the surrounding countryside. Matthew answered as best he could, aware of Lily's labored breathing in the back of the wagon where Grace had made her comfortable on blankets he kept for emergencies. "The air is different here," Grace observed, looking out at the vast prairie stretching before them. "Cleaner, somehow. Will it help her, do you think?" The question carried a weight of hope and desperation that Matthew recognized all too well. "Some doctors believe the western air benefits those with lung ailments," he answered carefully. "Dr. Miller in town has had success treating similar cases." Grace nodded, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I should be forthright with you, Mr. Quinn. Lily's condition is why we came west. The doctors in Boston gave her little chance, but I've read accounts of miraculous recoveries in this climate. I understand if this changes your feelings about our arrangement." Matthew glanced at her, struck by her directness. "Miss Porter, your letters made your devotion to your sister clear. I admire that. My home is more than large enough for the three of us, and Dr. Miller is one of the finest physicians I've encountered." Relief softened Grace's features, though the worry remained in her eyes. "Thank you." Few men would be so understanding. As they approached the ranch, Matthew felt a sudden nervousness. The two-story farmhouse, built by his father 15 years ago, had always seemed more than adequate. Now, through the eyes of these Boston women, he worried it would appear rough and primitive. The house sat on a gentle rise, surrounded by cottonwood trees that offered shade during the brutal summer months. A wide porch wrapped around the front and one side, with a swing his mother had insisted upon facing west toward the sunset. Behind the main house stood the barn, bunkhouse, and other outbuildings necessary for the ranch's operation. "It's beautiful," Grace said quietly as the house came into view, and the sincerity in her voice eased some of Matthew's concern. By the time they reached the front of the house, Lily's breathing had worsened, her face alarmingly pale. Without hesitation, Matthew gathered her in his arms, surprised at how little she weighed. "I've prepared the room with the eastern window," he explained, carrying her up the stairs with Grace following closely behind. "My mother always said the morning sun was healing." The room in question had been his parents', kept closed since their passing. He'd spent the past week airing it out, replacing the bedding and ensuring everything was immaculate. Now, as he gently placed Lily on the bed, he was grateful for those preparations. "I'll fetch water and heat some broth," he said, stepping back as Grace immediately began tending to her sister, removing her traveling clothes and making her comfortable. "Mr. Quinn," Grace called as he reached the door. When he turned, the vulnerability in her expression struck him. "Thank you." Those two simple words, heavy with gratitude, marked the beginning of their unusual household. The first week passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. Grace proved herself remarkably capable, quickly learning the layout of the house and taking charge of the kitchen with an efficiency that impressed Matthew. His housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, who came 3 days a week, found herself with an eager apprentice in Western cooking. Lily remained confined to bed, her condition neither improving nor worsening. Dr. Miller visited and prescribed a regimen of fresh air, nourishing food, and a tonic that seemed to ease her breathing somewhat. Each morning, Matthew would help carry her to a chair on the porch where she could sit wrapped in blankets, breathing the clean Kansas air while watching the daily activities of the ranch. It was during these moments that Matthew began to know the Porter sisters as individuals rather than the abstract concept of wife and sister-in-law he had imagined. Grace revealed herself to be practical and determined, with an unexpected dry wit that emerged when she was most tired. She approached each day with a methodical resolve that reminded Matthew of his mother, a woman who had faced frontier life with the same unflinching dedication. Lily, when not overcome by exhaustion or coughing fits, displayed a gentle thoughtfulness and an artist's eye for beauty. She noticed things others overlooked: the particular way light filtered through the cottonwoods at dusk, the varied songs of prairie birds, the changing colors of distant thunderheads. Despite her illness, there was a quiet joy in her observations that Matthew found himself looking forward to each day. "Mr. Quinn," Lily said one morning, her voice stronger than it had been since their arrival, "would you describe the seasons here? I've only ever known New England, and I find myself curious about what to expect." Matthew paused in his work of mending a bridle on the porch beside her. "The seasons here have their own character," he began, finding himself wanting to paint a picture she could see clearly. "Spring comes suddenly, sometimes overnight. The prairie turns green almost before your eyes, and wildflowers appear in such abundance you'd think someone scattered them deliberately." He continued, describing the intense heat of summer, the spectacular thunderstorms that rolled across the plains, the golden beauty of autumn, and the harsh, unpredictable winters. As he spoke, he noticed Grace standing in the doorway, listening with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "It sounds magnificent," Lily said when he finished, her eyes bright with interest. "Different from Boston in every way, but beautiful in its own right." "It can be harsh," he admitted. "But yes, there's a beauty here that gets into your blood." Later that evening, after Lily had been settled for the night, Grace joined Matthew on the porch. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and for several minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching as the colors deepened and then faded to the indigo of early night. "You have a gift for description," Grace said finally. "Lily enjoyed your stories of the seasons today. I haven't seen her so animated in months." Matthew shrugged, slightly embarrassed. "I just told her what I know." Nevertheless, it brightened her day. Grace hesitated, then continued. "Mr. Quinn, I realize our situation is unusual. We've been here a week now, and I feel we should discuss the terms of our arrangement." The formal tone brought Matthew back to reality. Despite sharing a home and meals, despite the growing ease between them, Grace remained Miss Porter, his mail-order bride in name only. They had not discussed the wedding that was presumably the purpose of her journey west. "Of course," he said, sitting straighter. "I understand your sister must be your priority now. There's no rush to formalize our arrangement." Grace studied him, her expression guarded in the fading light. "You've been more than generous, but I don't wish to take advantage of that generosity indefinitely. Once Lily is stronger, we should consider the future." "The future will wait," Matthew said firmly. "For now, let's focus on getting your sister well." A flicker of something relief, gratitude, crossed Grace's face before she nodded. "Thank you for your understanding. Good night, Mr. Quinn." As spring deepened into summer, a routine developed at the Quinn ranch. Matthew rose before dawn to work with his ranch hands, returning mid-morning to check on Lily and discuss the day's plans with Grace. Afternoons often found him back on the range, but he made a point of being present for the evening meal, followed by time on the porch if weather permitted. Lily's strength increased incrementally. By late June, she could walk short distances unassisted and spent longer periods outdoors. Her coughing fits became less frequent, though they remained severe when they did occur. Dr. Miller expressed cautious optimism during his visits, noting the improved color in her cheeks and the slight weight she had gained. Grace threw herself into running the household with an energy that sometimes concerned Matthew. She seemed determined to earn her keep, taking on cooking, cleaning, mending, and even learning to tend the kitchen garden from Mrs. Holloway. Only in the evenings did she allow herself to relax, often reading aloud to Lily and Matthew from one of the books they had brought from Boston. It was during one such evening, with Grace reading from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, while thunderstorms rumbled in the distance, that Matthew realized how comfortable their arrangement had become. The formal Mr. Quinn and Miss Porter had gradually given way to Matthew and Grace, at least in private conversation. Lily had taken to calling him Matt, a nickname no one had used since his childhood, and he found he didn't mind at all. The next morning, as Matthew helped Lily to her customary place on the porch, she asked unexpectedly, "Have you and Grace discussed the wedding?" Matthew nearly dropped the blanket he was arranging around her legs. "I know. We agreed to wait until you're stronger." Lily's perceptive gaze was disconcerting. "I'm concerned she's using me as an excuse to delay. Grace has always been cautious about her own happiness." "I wouldn't want to rush her," Matthew said carefully, unsure how to navigate this conversation. Lily smiled, a knowing look beyond her 19 years. "Of course not. But perhaps you might let her know that waiting on my account is unnecessary. I'm improving every day, and seeing her settled would ease my mind considerably." Before Matthew could formulate a response, Grace appeared with a tray of lemonade, ending the conversation. But Lily's words stayed with him throughout the day as he rode the boundaries of his property, checking fences and cattle with his foreman, Tom Wilkins. "You seem distracted today, boss," Tom commented as they stopped to water their horses at a stream. The older man had worked for Matthew's father and had known Matthew since he was a boy. "Domestic life not agreeing with you?" Matthew chuckled, splashing water on his face to cool off in the July heat. "Just the opposite. It's agreeing too well, perhaps." Tom's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Ah, getting attached to your Boston ladies, are you? Can't say I blame you. Miss Porter runs that household like she was born to it, and the little sister's a sweet thing." "That's just it, Tom. I didn't expect." Matthew trailed off, unsure how to explain the complex emotions he'd been experiencing. "Didn't expect to actually care for your mail-order bride." Tom finished for him. "Happens more often than folks admit. My own parents met that way, you know. Father sent for a wife from Chicago after his first wife died, expecting a housekeeper who could bear children. Got my mother instead, opinionated, educated, and stubborn as the day is long. They fought like cats and dogs for a year, then couldn't bear to be apart for the next 30. Matthew laughed at the description, which matched what he knew of Tom's parents. "Grace isn't what I expected either. She's stronger than she looks and smarter than most men I know. And prettier too, I'd wager," Tom added with a wink. "There is that," Matthew admitted, feeling his face warm in a way that had nothing to do with the summer sun. That evening, after Lily had retired, Matthew found himself alone with Grace on the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky in a display that still took his breath away even after a lifetime on the plains. "I spoke with Dr. Miller in town today," Matthew said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He believes Lily might be well enough to travel by September if she continues to improve at this rate." Grace turned to him, her profile silvered by moonlight. "Travel? To visit the hot springs in Colorado. He thinks the mineral waters might be beneficial for her lungs, especially before winter sets in." "That's very thoughtful, but I couldn't possibly." "It would be my wedding gift," Matthew interrupted, the words coming out before he could reconsider them. "If you still wish to proceed with our arrangement, that is." Grace's breath caught audibly. For a moment she said nothing, and Matthew feared he had misread the situation entirely. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "I do wish it. more than I expected to. Relief and something warmer flooded through him. Then perhaps we should discuss a date, unless you'd prefer to wait until after Lily's trip. No, Grace said firmly, turning to face him fully. Lily herself has been encouraging me to set a date. She worries I'm using her illness as an excuse. Matthew smiled. She said much the same to me this morning. Did she? Interfering little, Grace broke off, laughing softly. I suppose she knows me too well. In the moonlight, with her guard lowered and laughter softening her features, Grace looked younger, more carefree than he had yet seen her. Matthew felt a surge of protectiveness, mixed with a growing affection that surprised him with its intensity. Would August be too soon? He asked. Before the harvest begins in earnest, Grace considered this, her practical nature reasserting itself. Mid-August would give me time to order fabric from Wichita and make a suitable dress, and the weather should still be mild enough for Lily to attend comfortably. Mid-August it is, then. Matthew hesitated, then reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand. Her fingers were cool against his palm, and he felt them tremble slightly before curling around his. I want you to know, Grace, that while our beginning may be unconventional, I have every intention of being a good husband to you. Grace's eyes, reflecting starlight, met his with surprising vulnerability. And I intend to be a good wife, Matthew. Though I fear I'm rather more opinionated than the typical frontier bride. I wouldn't want the typical frontier bride, he replied honestly. I want you, exactly as you are. The words hung between them, more intimate than any they had yet shared. Matthew was suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth of her hand in his, of the soft sound of her breathing. Grace's gaze dropped to their joined hands, then back to his face. I should check on Lily, she said, though she made no move to rise. Of course, Matthew agreed, equally motionless. Finally, with what seemed like reluctance, Grace withdrew her hand and stood. Good night, Matthew. Good night, Grace. He watched her disappear into the house, the impression of her hand lingering on his palm like a promise. The announcement of their upcoming wedding spread quickly through the surrounding community, resulting in a steady stream of visitors bearing congratulations and, often, food. Grace found herself welcomed with curiosity and generally goodwill by the women of neighboring ranches and farms, though she detected an occasional note of skepticism about the Boston schoolteacher, who had come west as a mail-order bride. Lily thrived under the increased social activity, her natural charm winning over even the most reserved visitors. By early August, she was strong enough to accompany Grace on short trips into Wichita, where the sisters were something of a novelty in the growing town. It was during one such visit, as they waited for Grace's wedding dress fabric to be cut at the general store, that they encountered the first real unpleasantness since their arrival. Well, if it isn't the Bostonians, a woman's voice, sharp with disdain, cut through the pleasant murmur of the store. I hear you've managed to snare Matthew Quinn, Miss Porter. Quite an accomplishment for a mail-order bride. Grace turned to see a stylishly dressed woman of perhaps 30, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style that would have been more appropriate for a city drawing room than a Kansas general store. Beside her stood a younger woman who looked uncomfortable with the confrontation. Mrs. Harrington, Grace acknowledged with a polite nod, recognizing the wife of Wichita's banker from a previous introduction. How nice to see you again. I'm sure, Mrs. Harrington replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. I was just telling my sister how fortunate you are. Matthew Quinn is considered quite a catch in these parts. His ranch is one of the most successful in the county. I consider myself fortunate indeed, Grace agreed, maintaining her composure despite the obvious barb in the woman's words. though I suspect his character is an even greater asset than his property." Mrs. Harrington's smile tightened. "How quaint. Tell me, is it common practice in Boston for spinster schoolteachers to order husbands by mail and to bring along ailing relatives as part of the bargain?" Lily, who had been examining fabric nearby, stiffened at these words. Before Grace could respond, her sister stepped forward, her normally gentle demeanor replaced by a protective indignation. "My sister did not order anyone, Mrs. Harrington. She and Mr. Quinn made a mutual arrangement based on respect and compatibility. As for me, I was welcomed by Mr. Quinn's generosity, a quality that appears to be in short supply in certain quarters of Wichita society." Mrs. Harrington's face flushed an unbecoming red. "Well, I never—" "Agatha, please," her sister interrupted, clearly mortified. "We should be going. Mother is expecting us." Turning to Grace and Lily, she added apologetically, "Congratulations on your upcoming wedding, Miss Porter. I wish you both happiness." As the women departed, Lily swayed slightly, the confrontation having drained her limited reserves of energy. Grace quickly guided her to a chair the shopkeeper provided. "That was remarkably brave of you," Grace murmured, concerned by her sister's pallor. Lily managed a small smile. "She was being horrible to you. I couldn't bear it." "Miss Porter," the shopkeeper said, approaching with a glass of water for Lily, "don't you pay Agatha Harrington any mind. She's had her eye on Matthew Quinn for her widowed sister for years, but he never showed the slightest interest. You've upset her plans, is all." The shopkeeper's wife, cutting fabric nearby, nodded in agreement. "Matthew's one of the finest men in the county. We're all pleased he's finally found himself a wife, especially one who brings such brightness to his home. That sister of his, may she rest in peace, was the last female touch that place had, and that was nearly 15 years ago." Grace exchanged a startled look with Lily. "Sister? Matthew never mentioned a sister." The couple shared a glance before the woman continued carefully. "I suppose it's not something he discusses easily. Rebecca died when Matthew was 17. Typhoid took her, and both parents within a week of each other. Matthew was away working a cattle drive at the time. Came back to find himself alone with a ranch to run and 3 fresh graves." "How terrible," Lily whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He managed," the shopkeeper said, his voice gruff with old sadness. "Neighboring ranchers helped where they could, but Matthew was always independent. Worked himself nearly to death that first year, from what I heard." The revelation cast Matthew in a new light for Grace. His self-sufficient nature, his quiet strength, even the lingering sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes, all took on new meaning with this knowledge of his past. On the ride home, with Lily resting against her shoulder in the hired buggy, Grace found herself contemplating the man she was about to marry with a deepening appreciation. He had never sought sympathy for his loss, never used his tragedy to excuse any shortcoming. Instead, he had built a life of quiet dignity, and when loneliness finally became too much to bear, had reached out for companionship in the only way he knew how, with straightforward honesty. When they arrived back at the ranch, Matthew was working with a young colt in the corral near the house. He looked up at the sound of the buggy, his face breaking into a smile that caused an unexpected flutter in Grace's chest. "Welcome back," he called, securing the colt before coming to help them down. His hands were strong and sure as he lifted first Lily, then Grace to the ground. "How was your trip to town?" "Educational," Grace replied, meeting his gaze with new understanding. "We have much to discuss, but first, Lily needs to rest. The outing tired her more than expected." Once Lily was settled for a nap, Grace found Matthew in his small study, reviewing ledgers. He looked up when she entered, his expression questioning. "Is everything all right? You seemed troubled when you returned." Grace sat in the chair across from his desk, gathering her thoughts. "Why didn't you tell me about your family, about losing them all at once?" Matthew's face registered surprise, then understanding. "Ah, someone in town mentioned Rebecca. And your parents. The shopkeeper and his wife told us what happened." He closed the ledger, his movements deliberate. "It was a long time ago. I don't often speak of it." "Even to the woman you're about to marry," a flash of guilt crossed his features. "I should have told you. It didn't seem relevant to our arrangement." "Relevant?" Grace leaned forward, surprised by the hurt his words caused. "Matthew, your past. What shaped you, how could that not be relevant to a woman agreeing to share your life?" He was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the desk between them. "When I came home and found them gone, something in me closed off. It was easier to focus on the ranch, on tangible things I could control. The years passed, and it became habit not to look back, not to speak of them." "And now?" Grace asked softly. Matthew finally met her gaze, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "Now I find myself wanting to share those memories with you, to tell you about my mother's gardens and my father's terrible singing and Rebecca's laugh. But I'm out of practice with such things." Grace felt a tightening in her throat at his words. "Perhaps we can practice together. I could tell you about my parents and you could tell me about yours. We could remember them properly, not as wounds but as the people who shaped us." The smile that slowly spread across Matthew's face held a warmth that reached his eyes. "I'd like that very much, Grace." That evening, after dinner, they sat on the porch with Lily, who had recovered from her earlier fatigue. The air was heavy with approaching rain, the distant rumble of thunder promising a summer storm. As darkness fell, Matthew began to speak of his family tentatively at first, then with growing ease as memories long suppressed found voice. He told them of his father, stern but fair, who had come west with little more than determination, and had built the ranch through years of hard work and careful planning. Of his mother, gentle but surprisingly stubborn, who had created beauty in the harsh landscape with her gardens and handmade curtains. And of Rebecca, 4 years his junior, whose quick mind and quicker tongue had kept the household lively until illness had claimed her at just 13. In turn, Grace spoke of her own parents, her father, a professor of mathematics whose ordered mind had found expression in everything from his precisely trimmed beard to his meticulously organized bookshelves. Her mother, artistic and somewhat scattered, who had filled their Boston home with music and laughter. Lily added her own recollections, her perspective as the youngest providing details Grace had forgotten or never noticed. The stories flowed between them as the storm drew closer, lightning illuminating the prairie in brief, brilliant flashes. When the rain finally began, fat drops that quickly became a downpour, they moved inside to the parlor. The intimate atmosphere created by lamplight and the drumming of rain on the roof encouraged further confidences. Matthew spoke of the difficult years after his family's death, of learning to run the ranch through trial and error, of the loneliness that had eventually led him to place the advertisement that brought Grace into his life. "I never expected to find someone like you," he admitted, his voice low. "I hoped for companionship, perhaps eventually affection, but you and Lily have brought something back to this house that I thought was gone forever." "What's that?" Grace asked, aware of Lily watching them with barely concealed delight. "Life," Matthew said simply. "You've brought life back into these rooms." The wedding day dawned clear and pleasantly cool for mid-August, a brief respite from the summer heat that felt like a blessing. Grace stood at the bedroom window, watching as the first golden light touched the prairie, transforming dew-covered grass into a sea of diamonds. A soft knock at the door preceded Lily's entrance, already dressed in the pale blue gown they had worked on together over the past weeks. Her cheeks held more color than they had in months, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. "You're not dressed yet. The guests will be arriving in 2 hours, and Mrs. Holloway is already fretting about the food." Grace smiled at her sister's enthusiasm. "I wanted a quiet moment first, to think about how much has changed since we left Boston." Lily crossed the room to stand beside her at the window. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Not at all," Grace assured her, and was surprised to realize the absolute truth in those words. What had begun as a practical arrangement, a desperate gamble to save her sister and secure their future, had transformed into something she would never have dared hope for: the prospect of genuine happiness. With Lily's help, Grace dressed in the gown she had made from the fabric purchased in Wichita, a deep ivory silk that complemented her coloring and fell in simple, elegant lines. Her hair, usually confined in a practical bun, was arranged in a softer style with a few curls framing her face. "You look beautiful," Lily said when they had finished, tears gathering in her eyes. "Matthew won't know what hit him." "Don't you dare cry," Grace warned, fighting her own emotions. "We'll both be red-faced and puffy for the ceremony." Lily laughed, dabbing carefully at her eyes. "I'm just so happy for you both. When I was at my sickest in Boston, I worried constantly about what would happen to you if I died, who would care for you, where you would go. And now look at us." Grace embraced her sister gently, mindful of their dresses. "You're getting stronger every day, and I'm marrying a good man who cares for us both. It seems impossible that we could be so fortunate after everything." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Holloway's voice called through the wood, "Miss Porter, Reverend Daniels has arrived, and the guests are beginning to come. Mr. Quinn is asking if you need anything." "Please tell him we're nearly ready," Grace replied, giving Lily's hands one last squeeze before reaching for the simple bouquet of wildflowers Matthew had gathered for her at dawn. The ceremony took place in the front yard of the ranch house, under the spreading branches of the largest cottonwood tree. Neighbors and townspeople filled the chairs that had been arranged in rows, their Sunday best creating a colorful display against the green of the lawn. A pathway had been created between the seats, leading from the porch to where Matthew stood with Reverend Daniels, looking more handsome than Grace had ever seen him in a new suit ordered specially from Wichita. As Lily walked ahead of her down the improvised aisle, Grace felt a moment of pure clarity. This place, these people, they had become home in a way Boston never had. The path that had led her here, desperate and afraid for her sister's life, had somehow delivered her exactly where she was meant to be. Matthew's face as he watched her approach told her he felt the same certainty. His eyes never left hers as she walked toward him, and when she placed her hand in his, the warmth of his touch seemed to flow through her entire being. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows taking on new depth as they were spoken with genuine intent. When Matthew slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's, he had told her the night before, Grace felt the weight of history and promise it carried. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Daniels declared, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. "Mr. Quinn, you may kiss your bride." Matthew's kiss was gentle but held a promise that brought color to Grace's cheeks and caused a few knowing chuckles from the older members of the gathering. As they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, Grace caught sight of Lily, her face alight with happiness, applauding along with everyone else. The celebration that followed was joyous and relaxed, with tables set up under the trees laden with food prepared by Mrs. Holloway and neighboring women. Children played games on the lawn while adults visited and offered congratulations. Even Agatha Harrington made an appearance, though her felicitation seemed somewhat forced. As the afternoon progressed, Grace noticed Lily growing tired, though her sister tried to hide it. Discreetly, she mentioned this to Matthew, who immediately arranged for Tom Wilkins to drive Lily to the house to rest. She won't want to miss any of the celebration, Grace worried, watching as Tom gallantly offered Lily his arm. Matthew smiled, his hand warm at the small of her back. Tom will keep her company and bring her back when she's rested. He's quite taken with her if you haven't noticed. Grace had indeed noticed the middle-aged foreman's attentiveness to Lily throughout the day, bringing her refreshments and ensuring she always had a comfortable seat in the shade. "He's old enough to be her father," she observed, though without real concern. Tom's kindness seemed paternal rather than romantic. "Tom's a good man," Matthew said, "and he understands illness. His daughter died of consumption before he came to work for my father. I think Lily reminds him of her a bit." The revelation added another layer to Grace's understanding of the ranch and its inhabitants. So many lives touched by loss, yet resilience prevailed. She leaned slightly against Matthew's solid presence, grateful for his strength and the home he had opened to them. As evening approached, guests began to depart, leaving with final good wishes and, in many cases, invitations for the newlyweds to visit in the coming weeks. By sunset, only the closest neighbors remained for a final meal around the bonfire Tom and the other ranch hands had built. Lily returned, looking refreshed after her rest, and took a place beside Grace at the long table. "I wouldn't have missed this part for anything," she whispered. "It's like something from a storybook, a wedding feast on the prairie with the sunset painting everything gold." Looking around at the gathered faces illuminated by firelight and the last rays of the setting sun, Grace had to agree. There was a timeless quality to the scene, a sense of community and connection that transcended the relative newness of their settlement. Matthew rose to offer a toast, his voice carrying in the evening stillness. "To friends and neighbors who have become family, thank you for sharing this day with us. And to my wife," he turned to Grace with such tenderness that her heart seemed to expand in her chest, "thank you for bringing light back into my home and my life." The simple sincerity of his words moved Grace deeply. As glasses were raised and congratulations called out, she found herself blinking back tears of happiness she had never expected to feel when she first answered his advertisement. Later, after the last guests had departed and Lily had retired to her room with a knowing smile and a whispered, "Good night, Mrs. Quinn," Grace found herself alone with Matthew for the first time as his wife. Standing in the parlor where they had shared so many evening conversations, she felt suddenly shy. Matthew seemed to sense her nervousness. "It's been a long day," he said gently. "You must be tired." Grace nodded, grateful for his understanding. "It was a beautiful wedding." "More than I ever imagined." "The bride was certainly more beautiful than I ever imagined," Matthew replied, stepping closer to take her hands in his. "Grace, I want you to know that I understand this began as a practical arrangement for both of us. If you need time." She silenced him by rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his, surprising herself with her boldness. When she pulled back, the look of delighted shock on his face made her laugh softly. "I think," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that we've had quite enough time already." The transition from mail-order bride to wife was both simpler and more complex than Grace had anticipated. The daily rhythms of the ranch continued largely unchanged. Matthew still rose before dawn, still worked alongside his men, still returned to the house for the midday meal when possible. But now he returned to their shared bedroom each night, where they discovered the joys of marriage with increasing confidence and deepening affection. Lily continued to improve, her strength returning gradually but steadily. By late August, she was able to help with light household tasks and had taken over the kitchen garden completely, finding satisfaction in nurturing the plants that provided much of their food. The planned trip to the Colorado hot springs was scheduled for mid-September, with both Matthew and Grace to accompany her. One evening in early September, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Lily made an announcement that took both Grace and Matthew by surprise. "I've been corresponding with Mrs. Mitchell, the schoolmistress in Wichita," she said, setting aside her embroidery. "She's in need of an assistant for the younger children, particularly one who can teach music. She's offered me the position, beginning after our return from Colorado." Grace stared at her sister in astonishment. "Lily, are you certain you're strong enough? Teaching is demanding work, as I well know." "It would only be mornings, 3 days a week," Lily explained. "Dr. Miller thinks it would be beneficial for me to have meaningful occupation now that my health is improving. And I've missed music so desperately." A shadow crossed her face at this admission. "My hands aren't strong enough yet for extended piano playing, but I can manage enough to teach the basics to children." Matthew, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I think it's an excellent idea if Dr. Miller approves, and it so happens I know of a piano that's sitting unused in town." Both sisters turned to him with questioning looks. "The widow Jenkins passed last month," he explained. "Her son is selling her house and contents, but the piano is too large for anyone to take easily." "I could inquire about purchasing it for you, Lily. It could go in the front parlor." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Matthew, truly, I couldn't ask for such a gift." "You didn't ask," he pointed out with a smile, "and it would be for all of us. This house hasn't had music since my mother and Rebecca played. I've missed it without realizing how much." Grace reached over to squeeze her husband's hand, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "It would be wonderful to hear music in the house again." The piano arrived the following week, delivered by a wagon from town, and installed in the parlor with much direction from Lily, who insisted it needed to be positioned for proper light and acoustics. Though not a grand instrument, it had been well maintained by its previous owner and required only minor tuning to restore it to working condition. The first evening after its arrival, Lily sat at the keyboard with visible trepidation. "My fingers are still weak," she warned. "Don't expect too much." But as she began to play a simple melody, her face transformed with joy. The notes filled the house, somewhat hesitant at first, then growing in confidence as her muscle memory returned. Grace and Matthew sat together on the settee, watching as Lily reconnected with the art that had once been her greatest passion. "I had forgotten how beautifully she plays," Grace murmured, leaning against Matthew's shoulder. He kissed the top of her head, his arm tightening around her waist. "Another kind of healing," he observed quietly. The trip to Colorado proved even more beneficial than they had hoped. The journey itself was made comfortable by Matthew's careful planning. They traveled by train, staying in the best accommodations he could arrange, with frequent stops to ensure Lily didn't become overtaxed. The hot springs themselves were a revelation to both Porter sisters, who had never experienced anything like the naturally heated mineral waters. Under Dr. Miller's written guidance and the supervision of the resort's physician, Lily took daily soaks of gradually increasing duration. The effect on her condition was remarkable. Her breathing eased noticeably, and the persistent cough that had plagued her for so long began to subside. For Grace, the journey served as an unexpected honeymoon. Away from the responsibilities of the ranch and household, She and Matthew explored the mountain town together during Lily's rest periods, enjoying the novelty of being simply husband and wife without other demands on their time. "I never imagined such beauty," Grace said as they stood together on a viewpoint overlooking the valley, the mountains rising majestically around them. "Boston has its charms, but nothing like this." Matthew, watching her rather than the view, smiled. "I'm glad I get to see it through your eyes. I've been west before, but never really stopped to appreciate it properly." Grace turned to him, struck by the open affection in his expression. Over the weeks of their marriage, the reserved rancher had gradually revealed the depths of feeling beneath his quiet exterior. Now, away from the watchful eyes of neighbors and ranch hands, he was even more demonstrative, taking her hand as they walked, stealing kisses when Lily was occupied elsewhere, holding her close through the cool mountain nights. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Grace smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I'm thinking how fortunate I am. When I answered your advertisement, I was desperate and afraid. I never expected to find love." Matthew turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "I never expected it either, but I'm profoundly grateful that we did." By the time they returned to the ranch in early October, Lily was stronger than she had been since falling ill nearly a year earlier. Her cheeks held a healthy color, and though she still tired more easily than before her illness, her breathing was markedly improved. Dr. Miller, examining her upon their return, declared himself astounded by her progress. "I wouldn't go so far as to pronounce you cured, Miss Porter," he cautioned, "but the improvement is remarkable. Continue with your current regimen, and I see no reason why you shouldn't live a full and active life, with reasonable precautions." This pronouncement was cause for celebration, and that evening they invited Tom and Mrs. Holloway to share a special dinner. Lily, sitting at the piano afterward, played with more vigor than she had yet attempted, filling the house with joyous music that seemed to express everything words could not. As autumn deepened toward winter, the rhythm of ranch life changed with the seasons. The cattle were moved to winter pastures, the last vegetables harvested from the garden, the house prepared for the coming cold. Lily began her position at the school, returning each afternoon with stories of her pupils and their progress. The work suited her gentle nature, and the limited hours allowed her to maintain her strength. Grace found herself adapting to the role of rancher's wife with surprising ease. The skills she had learned as the eldest daughter, managing a household after her mother's death, served her well, and she discovered an unexpected aptitude for ranch accounts, gradually taking over the bookkeeping from Matthew with his grateful blessing. "You have a better head for figures than I ever did," he admitted one evening as she corrected an error in his ledgers. "My father would have appreciated your precision." "I think we would have got along well, your father and I," Grace replied, smiling at the thought. "From what you've told me, we share a certain methodical approach." Matthew laughed, pulling her into his lap despite her token protests about the impropriety. "Methodical, is it? That's a kind way of saying stubborn and exacting." "I prefer particular," Grace countered, settling against him with a contentment that still amazed her. "And you seem to tolerate it well enough." "Tolerate? Grace Quinn, I adore every particular inch of you, and well you know it." His kiss effectively ended any further debate on the subject. As November brought the first snow, Grace began to suspect a new development that would change their lives once again. Her monthly courses, regular as clockwork since girlhood, had failed to appear for the second month in a row. Other signs confirmed her suspicion: a persistent queasiness in the mornings, a new sensitivity to certain smells, a fullness in her breasts that Matthew had noticed with masculine appreciation, before she herself had identified its cause. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news, choosing a quiet evening when Lily was visiting a friend in town. Matthew had just returned from checking the cattle, bringing the scent of cold air and wood smoke with him as he entered the parlor where Grace sat with her mending. "You're looking thoughtful," he observed, warming his hands at the fire before joining her on the settee. "Has something happened?" Grace set aside her sewing, suddenly nervous despite her certainty that the news would be welcome. "Nothing has happened exactly. But something will be in about 6 months' time." Matthew looked puzzled for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Grace, are you saying we're going to have a baby?" she confirmed, watching his face anxiously. "In late spring, Dr. Miller thinks." The joy that transformed Matthew's expression erased any doubt she might have harbored. He gathered her in his arms with a gentleness that belied his excitement, pressing kisses to her hair, her forehead, finally her lips. "A baby," he repeated when he could speak again, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Grace leaned against him, relieved and happy beyond words. "I hoped you would be pleased." "Pleased?" Matthew laughed, the sound vibrating through his chest where her head rested. "Grace, there aren't words for what I'm feeling. When my family died, I thought that part of my life was over the part where I belonged to people and they belonged to me. Then you and Lily came, and slowly I began to hope again. And now this." He placed his hand reverently over her still flat stomach. "It's more than I ever dared dream." Lily's reaction to the news was equally joyous, though tinged with practical concerns about Grace's health and comfort during the coming winter months. She immediately appointed herself guardian of her sister's well-being, monitoring her diet and rest with loving but sometimes exasperating attention. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," Grace protested after Lily insisted on taking over the bread making because the kneading was too strenuous. "Humor her," Matthew advised privately. "She needs to feel useful, and frankly, I prefer having an ally in keeping you from overexertion." The winter passed more quickly than Grace had expected. Filled with preparations for the baby and the comfortable domesticity that had become the hallmark of their household. Christmas was celebrated with a simplicity that nonetheless felt abundantly rich: a small tree decorated with handmade ornaments, gifts selected with thoughtful care, carols played by Lily on the piano while they sat before the fire. As Grace's body changed with the growing life inside her, Matthew's tenderness increased proportionally. He treated her with a reverence that might have amused her had it not been so genuinely sweet, insisting on taking over tasks he deemed too strenuous, reading to her in the evenings when her back ached too much for comfortable sitting, massaging her swollen feet without being asked. By March, when the first hints of spring began to soften the winter landscape, Grace's condition was obvious to anyone who saw her. The women of neighboring ranches and Wichita began visiting more frequently, bringing baby clothes and practical advice. Mrs. Holloway, who had assisted at countless births, promised to be present when Grace's time came, a reassurance that eased both her anxiety and Matthew's. April brought warm days interspersed with spring storms, and with them, increasing discomfort for Grace as the baby grew larger and more active. She found herself waddling rather than walking, her once slender frame now rounded and ungainly. "I must look a fright," she lamented one evening as she caught sight of herself in the bedroom mirror, her hands supporting her lower back. Matthew, watching her from the doorway with undisguised admiration, shook his head. "You've never been more beautiful," Grace scoffed, though his sincerity was obvious. "You're a terrible liar, Matthew Quinn. I'm as big as one of your prize cows." He crossed the room to stand behind her, his hands replacing hers at her back, skillfully working the tight muscles there. "You're carrying our child," he said simply. "How could that be anything but beautiful to me?" His reflection in the mirror showed such honest wonder that Grace felt her irritation melting away. She leaned back against him, allowing herself to see what he saw: not an awkward, swollen body, but the miracle of new life they had created together. "Not much longer now," she murmured, placing her hands over his where they had moved to cradle her rounded abdomen. "Dr. Miller says early May, most likely." As if in response, the baby kicked sharply, causing both parents to laugh in surprised delight. "Strong," Matthew observed proudly. "Like his mother." "Or her father," Grace countered, unwilling to predict the child's gender despite Lily's confident assertions that she was carrying a boy. "Either way, this little one is eager to make an appearance." May arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the prairie and increasing anticipation in the Quinn household. Lily had finished preparing the nursery, transforming a small room adjacent to the master bedroom with cheerful curtains, a cradle Matthew had crafted during the winter evenings, and all the necessary supplies for the new arrival. Grace's labor began in the early hours of May 12th, a mild spring night with a full moon illuminating the land in silver light. She woke Matthew with a hand on his shoulder and the quiet announcement, "It's time." What followed was a day of intense work and profound emotion. Mrs. Holloway arrived within the hour of being summoned, her practical efficiency immediately setting the tone for what was to come. Lily remained at Grace's side throughout, wiping her brow, holding her hands, murmuring encouragement when pain threatened to overwhelm her resolve. Matthew, banished to the downstairs after being deemed more hindrance than help by Mrs. Holloway, paced the floors and periodically sent ranch hands to town with progress reports for Dr. Miller, who had promised to come if needed, but had assured them that Mrs. Holloway was more experienced with births than he was. As afternoon faded toward evening, Grace's labor intensified. The pain seemed endless, wave after wave washing over her until she felt she might be swept away entirely. Just when she thought she could endure no more, Mrs. Holloway announced it was time to push. "I can see the head," the older woman reported after several exhausting efforts. "One more good push, Grace." Gathering her remaining strength, Grace bore down with a determination born of desperation and maternal instinct. There was a moment of searing pressure, then sudden release as her child slipped into the world with a lusty cry that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "A boy," Mrs. Holloway announced triumphantly, quickly wrapping the squalling infant in a prepared blanket. "A fine, strong son." Lily, tears streaming down her face, squeezed Grace's hand. "He's perfect," she whispered, looking at the red-faced, indignant newborn. "Absolutely perfect." After the afterbirth was delivered and Grace made comfortable with fresh bedding, Mrs. Holloway placed the now swaddled baby in her arms. Looking down at her son's face, the tiny nose, the determined chin, the shock of dark hair plastered to his head, Grace felt a love so overwhelming it took her breath away. "Send for Matthew," she requested, unable to tear her gaze from the miracle in her arms. "He should meet his son." Matthew entered the room with uncharacteristic hesitation, his face drawn with hours of worry and anticipation. When he saw Grace propped against the pillows, tired but radiant, holding their child, his expression transformed to one of such naked joy that both Lily and Mrs. Holloway discreetly withdrew to give the new family privacy. "Come meet your son," Grace invited softly, shifting the bundle slightly to better display the baby's face. Matthew approached the bed slowly, as if afraid to disturb the tableau before him. When he finally looked down at his son, his eyes filled with tears he made no attempt to hide. "He's incredible," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "You're both incredible." Grace patted the edge of the bed, inviting him to sit beside her. "Would you like to hold him?" With careful movements that belied his strength, Matthew gathered the tiny bundle into his arms. The baby, who had been dozing, opened his eyes unfocused but seemingly looking directly at his father's face. "Hello, Thomas," Matthew said softly, using the name they had chosen if the baby was a boy after Grace's father. "Welcome to the world, son." As the spring gave way to summer, baby Thomas thrived, growing and changing with a speed that astonished his parents and delighted his aunt. His arrival completed their family circle in a way none of them had anticipated when the Porter sisters first arrived at the ranch. What had begun as a practical arrangement, a mail-order bride seeking security for herself and her ailing sister, a lonely rancher offering a home in exchange for companionship, had blossomed into a love story none of them could have written for themselves. On a warm evening in late June, as the first fireflies of the season began to flicker in the gathering dusk, the Quinn family sat together on the porch. Lily played with Thomas on a quilt spread nearby, the baby's delighted giggles punctuating the peaceful evening sounds. Matthew and Grace sat side by side on the swing, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Grace asked, watching her sister and son with contented eyes. "When you sent that advertisement, did you ever think that I'd find everything I never knew I needed?" Matthew completed her thought, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I hoped for a companion, perhaps eventually a mother for children I vaguely imagined. I never dreamed of finding a partner who would challenge and compliment me, or a sister-in-law who would bring music back into my home, or a son who would fill my heart to bursting." Grace smiled, lifting her face for a proper kiss. "And I only hoped for a safe haven for Lily, somewhere she could heal. I never expected to find a home for my heart as well." "From the blanket," Lily called. "If you two are finished being sentimental, I think someone wants his mother." Thomas, having spotted his parents, was struggling to roll over, his face scrunching with the effort and frustration. Grace laughed and moved to gather him up, settling back beside Matthew with the baby in her arms. "You regret any of it?" Matthew asked as Thomas grasped his finger with surprising strength. "Coming west, marrying a stranger, building this life so far from everything you knew?" Grace considered the question seriously, thinking of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the desperate decision to answer a stranger's advertisement, the terrifying train journey west with a gravely ill sister, the adjustment to ranch life, and the gradual, beautiful unfolding of love where once there had been only practical necessity. "Not for a single moment," she answered truthfully. "Every step of the path, however difficult, led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be." As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky, the Quinn family sat together in the perfect contentment of those who have found, against all odds, exactly where they belong. The ranch house, once silent with old grief, now resonated with the sounds of life and love, a baby's laughter, a piano's melody, the quiet conversation of a couple whose unlikely beginning had blossomed into a love story neither could have imagined but both would cherish for all their days.